Hello, welcome to 10th webinar of ICOMOS ICOCH on underwater cultural heritage. Normally we had two speakers, but unfortunately Tatiana, who is our friend, couldn't come. And now we have only one speaker, Dr. Arturo Rey da Silva. To read his biography, I would like to invite Dr. Chris Underwood, who is the president of ICOCH.
Thanks, Hakan. As Arturo reminded me, it's quite an extensive CV, so I've tried to pick out the highlights. Arturo is a maritime archaeologist, and he considers his speciality international cooperation, capacity building, and heritage diplomacy. Between 2011 and 2018, he was part of the UNESCO Secretariat for the 2001 Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, where he worked giving technical assistance to member states. Since 2018, Arturo has worked with UNESCO headquarters, external coordinator and consultant, with several UNESCO field offices, Africa, Central Asia, Latin America, establishing regional capacity strengthening strategies, outreach initiatives, policy-orientated programs, etc., etc. He, not so long ago, graduated with his PhD, which focused on the institutionalization of underwater archaeology within international cooperation schemes and its contribution to sustainable development. Arturo is visiting lecturer at various universities, including Alexandria, the American University in Beirut, Cadiz, and Externado in Colombia. He's also a member of ICOCH since 2019. He currently and recently joined the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh as Honor Frost Scholar in Marine Cultural Heritage, where he analyses the outputs and outcomes from the Rising from the Depths Network RFTD project. Arturo, I think it's you take the floor and let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much, Hakan. First of all, I would like to thank you for the organization of these wonderful seminars that put us a date in our agendas every month to consider and reflect about underwater cultural heritage. It's a pity that Tatiana Villegas can make it today. I talked to her earlier today and she apologized, but she had an emergency, a UNESCO emergency, and she couldn't make it. I mean, she would like to talk more. Maybe postpone her presentation for later. She will see with you guys on that. The reason why I mentioned that is because somehow some of the things I was gonna say, she was gonna explore further, especially in terms of intangible cultural heritage on that. So that being said, let me share my screen. You can all see my screen, yes?
Yes.
Perfect. So with this presentation and with these webinars that are dedicated to the 20th anniversary of the UNESCO 2001 Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage, I wanted somehow in these 20 years of the convention, bring a reflection to the table. I was planning to do a presentation of 20 minutes, so we could have some time eventually to discuss further, but now we can do it in a more relaxed way. And if there are questions from the floor that needs to be answered on the spot, please feel free, and maybe Hakan or you, Chris, can let me know, and maybe we can convert this into a discussion, because it's definitely a reflection on things that have changed in the panorama of underwater cultural heritage, maritime archaeology, and how this is being translated into policy as well. It's definitely, we are in a moment, the 20th anniversary of the convention, in which we have to reflect on different aspects of the governance of the convention, on the meaning of underwater cultural heritage and the scope and where it gets. Definitely 20 years ago, when it was adopted, the convention, it reflected what was the different threats that underwater cultural heritage was facing in the 90s, 80s, and 70s, and that were being raised already by the international community, and especially the archaeological community, that needed to have response at that time. Nowadays, I mean, different threats have raised, and different issues too. And we are in a scenario in which global policies like the United Nations 2030 agenda, the UN Decade for Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, and different international agreed sustainable development goals, like for instance, the Samoa Pathway or the African 2063 Agenda for Sustainable Development, are marking, aligning the policies of nations and international government organizations towards those objectives. That means that somehow the international policies are driving national implementation, national policies towards those aims, affecting local communities and local heritage. That means also that the 2001 Convention, in the application, interpretation, and methods that are used by countries to implement it, needs to align with international policies, global policies for sustainable development, is somehow the Bible. And also, long ago, Chris was presenting on sustainable development too, and saying the importance of these instruments that are gonna somehow put into the table the discipline that we are working for, and how the past and the information we have from how the societies interacted with different dynamics in the sea or in other water spaces can help us understanding the current challenges that we are facing. So that's more or less the reflection I wanted to bring into the table. And somehow this is also a result of the evolution of the term and concept of underwater cultural heritage. That if we look into the different definitions that we had through the different international agreements, for instance, the first time that appears the concept of underwater cultural heritage is in the recommendation 848 in 1978 of the Council of Europe, in which we see that we talk about objects. Now, this is somehow influenced also by the discussions that we're having, that were taking place at that time very lately in the international, the law of the sea, the United Nations law of the sea, that inserted only two very fine articles without much detail on the protection of objects of cultural and archaeological character. And that moved towards discussions in the 80s and the 90s, and we arrived to the UNESCO convention, the UNESCO 2001 Convention definition that enlarges that to understand all traces of human existence having cultural, historical, or archaeological character. We all know the definition. We all know about the blanket protection. That is something that is being explained. And we all know that also this thing of cultural, historical, and archaeological character is also subjective to what we consider to be cultural, historical, or archaeological character in different definitions. No? That was the definition that we had in the convention, and the definition that we widely use also in ICOMOS and different management tools. In other aspects, we talk today also about enlarging that definition, and as it was also reflected by the evaluation of the internal oversight services to the 2001 Convention, they need to talk more about those links that underwater cultural heritage has with nature, but also with societies nowadays. No? And that tells us about this term that I take here, the definition from John Henderson, marine cultural heritage, that somehow relates to all the tangible aspects and intangible aspects of the human relations with the sea dynamics, estuaries, and also river courses, in which that we create heritage, no? And there's a link in nature, culture, and society at the same time that relate us, the underwater archaeological finds to what the society and the environment is thinking. So we are enlarging those concepts as somehow a way of going towards integrated management approaches in cultural heritage, in which nature, culture are together forming solutions towards those global agendas that I discussed before. In a way, I mean, this reflects also the theoretical advances of maritime archaeology that happened in the 90s, at the beginning of the 90s, with the introduction of maritime cultural landscape, maritime archaeological landscape by Westerdahl at the beginning of the 90s, and that advanced the theoretical framework in which we made maritime archaeology and interpretation. That reflects that now we try to push that into management and to translate it into policies, as well as it was done somehow in the World Heritage Convention in 92. The World Heritage Convention is somehow the wider international instrument to verify and trace the different speeches, discourses, tensions, and conflicts that exist in the world around, and what we define to be heritage and what we define that we need to protect for future generations. The World Heritage Convention that was adopted in 1972 started inserting the concept of cultural landscapes during the 80s, in trying to mix that relation between nature and culture and society, and eventually was approved in '92 in World Heritage, in the World Heritage Committee, the 16th session, acknowledging that cultural landscapes were the combined works of nature and man, and as it was designated in the Article 1 of the Convention. So 20 years after the Convention was adopted. In any case, I mean, far from, you know, in the Convention, far from having the cultural landscape approach being inserted into the operational guidelines, is something that we can see that in the further debates is being inserted, especially when we talk about marine special planning, marine protected areas, or integrated coastal management. In the sphere, on the atmosphere, in the arena of management, is something that countries and experts are calling for, because it's a way also of joining all the interested stakeholders in taking decisions and avoiding conflict towards protecting heritage. But well, here, when I put the title of this conference as Underwater Cultural Heritage Internationalism, I took the term thinking about the seminal paper by Merriman, Cultural Property Internationalism, no? In which he uses this term as the concern expressed by all the international community, but most of the representative countries, government representatives, and other stakeholders on the preservation and enjoyment of what collectively they consider worth passing to the next generations in form of heritage. Obviously, when you decide what to pass to the next generations at international level, you are deciding also not to pass all the type of heritage. So you are trying to reach a consensus of what is this concern and what constitutes heritage. One of the first times that we started having that international concern, that we can see that in the historical record, it was especially with the Napoleon's campaign to Italy and different expos that did of Italian art that we can see in different papers and different criticism from the time, from the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. Intellectuals were already criticizing that. There were a joint collective consent for the protection of cultural heritage in Italy through war, you know, in the event of conflict. We see that at the end of the Second World War, as a result of the Second World War, we know that the foundation of UNESCO was especially formed through the calamities and catastrophes that occurred after with the Second World War. And the 54 Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property already expresses very well that ethos, that philosophy that we are gonna see in UNESCO in the whole of history. You know, cultural property is the cultural heritage of mankind. Also, I mean, there is a big statement in that convention that tells us that damage to cultural property belonging to any people whatsoever means damage to the cultural property of all mankind. So this big statement is what formed already the international view that we need to protect cultural heritage in a consensual way between all states, member states, and concerned parties at international level. That extended from being a concern from the destruction in the event of war to preservation of heritage in different stages. And even if UNESCO has been criticized from being a westernized organization with conservation of views of conservation and archaeological practice coming specifically from the West, we have seen in the World Heritage Convention how they are trying to advance in the debate through different debates also between the different state parties. For instance, I mean, the different debate on the issue of authenticity, what authenticity was. You know, in the 90s was a huge debate between different states because it means something different in Asia and something different also in Europe, no? Until they have reached a document, and it's typical in this type of organizations, the NARA document and recommendations that help somehow integrating and making heritage much more fluid, if you want, no? Because we have to understand heritage, and at least that's the way I say it, as a process that is around the remains, the archaeological and tangible remains of a specific cultural expression. No? The processes of interaction between stakeholders, the processes of valuing, the links that exist between conservation and nature, etc. And those processes are in constant movement, and they are changing. They are completely changing. No? So this is what Team Winter called us the international phenomenon of heritage, in what calls international heritage diplomacy as an arena of governance of institutions and as a space of both cooperation and contestation. Here in the bottom, a picture of the foundation of UNESCO in London in 1946. But is it maritime archaeology international? Well, archaeology as a discipline, we could say that has an incredible international component. Either from the beginning, if that component was completely tied to colonial powers going to different places in order to boost national identities. And now we try somehow archaeology to break against that past, trying to change the narrative towards a much more international or globalizing view. Or if we look into archaeologists as ourselves, we like to consider ourselves international cosmopolitans. We go to international conferences, we publish in different newspapers. I'm from one country working in another and speaking in another language. And here, this webinar is essentially an example of how international this can get. But at the end, if we look into the controversies of that internationality, archaeologists depend and rely on national laws and different practices in order to develop their own work. At the same time, archaeologists, we have our own bias, our own political views, even if we don't realize we put them into the table. And that is seen in the debates in UNESCO among the different governing bodies. You see how experts, for instance, in the scientific and technical advisory body, the technical body of the convention, are mixing different expertise. One of the expertise, and they have to master it, is the representation of the country. And that sometimes may be in conflict with what they think as experts, but they have to master, all those biases. One of the things that we saw at the beginning, also in the 50s, is that internationalism of cultural heritage, and that is translated also in a recommendation made by UNESCO in 56 regarding international principles applicable to archaeological excavations. In this recommendation already, the archaeologists recognized as an international discipline itself, although with a national bias, and puts the responsibility into the states for applying the recommendations that is saying. In this recommendation already, excavations in the territorial waters of the states are being recognized. It's the time in which the 50s underwater archaeology is being formed as we know it, with the invention also of the scuba in the 40s, but also when threats and concerns towards its protections started. It's also the period, this decade, in which different pioneers of underwater archaeology, like Nino Lamboglia, Jos Bass, Uno Frost, etc., called the attention of the world, telling that we needed to have national legislations to protect this. And then in the 60s, soon we will have the first international legislations focused on underwater cultural heritage, on shipwrecks specifically, in France and in Australia. But at the same time, they are calling for the need to protect underwater cultural heritage that is found in international waters, because we didn't have that jurisdiction and understanding on how to protect it and how to get there. They were thinking obviously mainly on shipwrecks as the main item, the main archaeological site to be protected. This was one of the main focus of the period, and it's been always a main focus of underwater archaeology, even in the discourses internationally, which has created some problems in some places. We'll come to that. No? But the discipline of maritime archaeology itself, it can be understood as international because of the same nature of the sites themselves and the cooperation that is needed. But I mean, to mention a sentence that Tyve Maberle said in one of his articles talking about the same subject, especially when the staff was created and when he was president of ICOMOS. One could perhaps rightly argue that maritime culture is always embedded locally. One could argue that teams always have a dominant nationality, and one could argue that in international waters, one always works from a national base and a home port of registration. But it is hardly possible to argue otherwise that maritime archaeology being international archaeology. This internationalism of underwater cultural heritage is already acknowledged later in the first international recommendation done for underwater cultural heritage, and the only one for the time being. The Sofia Charter done by ICOMOS in '96, where ICOMOS had a prominent work, because it was the main objective of the foundation of ICOMOS, the first drafting of this chapter and that was adopted in Sofia, Bulgaria in '96. In the same introductory text of the recommendation already tell us that the underwater cultural heritage is an underwater resource. It's an international resource, and it has to be there like that. It's somehow presenting the difficulty of management that we had at the time and that we still have in order to agree between different countries, in order to use the same type of language when managing discoveries in international waters, for instance. No? This is later translated into the 2001 Convention with many of the articles that we already know. And already in the preamble is telling us of the importance of underwater cultural heritage as an integral part of humanity, an important element of history of peoples, nations. I mean, we see that is the wording that UNESCO uses in different ways in most of the conventions, and also we see it in its constitution, creating this internationalism of heritage itself. We see it later in the different articles, and we see in the articles as well how that international feature of heritage is left for countries to preserve. It's a responsibility of the country. So somehow the philosophy of individuality to protect and to be responsible for international effects and impacts is being presented here. Now, state parties shall preserve underwater cultural heritage for the benefit in conformity with the provision of the convention. And then it talks about the importance of international cooperation and the importance also of the power of the states. So here we see two things that we already are feeling as maybe sometimes complicated in the application of the international of a convention like the 2001 Convention. It's a convention that very technically is pushing the states to protect underwater cultural heritage, giving guidance and rules on the best standards to have activities directed to underwater cultural heritage. At the same time, there have to be the nation, the member states with sovereignty, the ones that have to implement the convention in the best possible way, but depending on the capacities, the resources, the priorities, or what they understand as heritage as a priority in the same country, they will do it in one way or the other. And as we know, there is not any evaluation and reporting mechanism in the 2000 Convention yet that tell us, how countries are moving towards achieving the goals that they committed to in an international convention. This also takes us to think, you have local narratives, different local views, different ways of dealing with maritime and underwater cultural heritage in different countries, and different uses and benefits that can help local communities to build up sustainable development that are not so taken into consideration by the national authorities and presented to UNESCO. So we have different levels that we can see in the different activities that UNESCO is doing and is trying to change. Another thing that the 2001 Convention has as an important international, truly international action is the cooperation mechanism for discoveries and actions done in the exclusive economic zone, or the continental shelf, or in the area, using the terminology approved by the law of the sea that is taken also by the convention. One example of this, and the only one for the time being, is the notification by Italy of underwater cultural heritage being found in the Scherchi banks. Then the responsibility, many states after the notification shown interest, and then there is a state that was selected to be the coordinating state for taking the actions, always in consultation. So there is a need through this, and we see it in the convention, to give back the decision and the action to a state, to a nation itself, always in consultation with the other states. In the picture, we have one of the first coordination meetings for these Scherchi banks in 2019, and I think in the meeting of state parties of the convention this year, the scientific technical advisory body meeting, they approved a mission, a joint mission between the different states. France was providing the logistics to the site itself. This is a very basic table that I did last year for my PhD. I'm really sorry it's in French, but it's to see how in the governing bodies of the convention, there's the only convention that deals with underwater cultural heritage, the only instrument that takes decisions between states and international level, how the different state, the different layers of society in a very broad way are represented. I mean, you see how, for instance, I put a global level on the top of international to mean all these international sustainable development agendas and bigger agendas that need to be, towards which the different conventions and agreements need to work with or align towards to. Then we have the international, where we find ourselves the conventions with the main governing body, which is the meeting of state parties. And then the advisory body, that we see here, and the secretariat of the convention. In one side, we have the different representation of the states towards UNESCO, so the ones that talk and send decisions and comments to UNESCO, which is the national commissions at national level, and the delegations that are in Paris. There are other means, and those means are obviously towards the experts that they may have in competent authorities, talking to the advisory body or to the different accredited or bodies like the NGOs or the UNITWIN, or I put here ICOMOS itself. One thing that we have to understand also is that the meeting of state parties, not necessarily the people who take decision and talks there, they have the necessary expertise. Most of the countries of the 72 state parties that ratified, they bring experts from the countries if they have them, or they bring some advice from the Ministry of Culture. But most of them are unavailable to send that capacity. They send diplomats or representatives or cultural heritage experts in general. And depending on the ability of different experts to negotiate, to put the interests of the countries regarding international affairs, but also cultural heritage, the balance and the decisions will be influenced. Following, obviously, you have the advices from the advisory body, but those advices are not decision binding. The sovereignty rests on the states, and also in the ability and expertise in order to combine those different international interests in an international setting itself. One thing that strikes us all, I mean, you see in green those bodies where we may have some archaeological expertise, some maritime archaeological expertise. We see that sometimes those that are much more in advisory capacity, where we have the expertise, are the ones who have relations to the local realities, where the experts towards the community of expertise with the communities of users. If I use the terms of, I think, Loendal for heritage in that sense. And they also at national level, and they have also expertise in different areas also at global level. But what strikes us is that at local level, there is not any representation or any voice of concerned communities that may want to somehow express what they feel, what they sense, not only to the national counterparts, but maybe to the meeting of state parties. Now, I know several countries, some of them haven't ratified the convention, others that have done it. The heritage agencies are working with different communities for raising awareness, for understanding the traditional knowledge paths. But in most of the cases, that really doesn't happen. And it's something that was also raised in other conventions, like in the World Heritage Convention. And in the year 2000, the World Heritage Convention tried to create a body, and a kind of committee of local and indigenous communities that work also with the committee. But eventually that was rejected by state parties because of issues of rights of decision, jurisdiction nationally, etc. And the World Heritage Convention created a forum of local and indigenous communities that combines and made dialogue with the decision makers of the committee. So they're looking for ways of dialogue, and that's something that in the 2000 Convention hasn't been done yet. But the winds are blowing towards that direction, to have much more representativeness of local stakeholders, concerned local stakeholders, in the decision-making processes, as the recently approved theory of change is pointing to. These things are something that was already mentioned by the internal evaluation of the 2001 Convention. We don't need to go into detail. I mean, we probably all know the different recommendations of the internal evaluation to the Convention that made different interviews to local stakeholders, national delegates, archaeologists, etc. But what they saw, it was really important to have the participation of local communities in the safeguarding of underwater cultural heritage. They also saw that there was a need to enlarge the values and links of underwater cultural heritage with other programs, not only within UNESCO, but other concepts of heritage, in a way that somehow is much more related to cultural maritime landscapes, to ecosystem-based approaches, etc. They also conveyed UNESCO the idea that they needed to change this discourse of the way underwater cultural heritage was presented. And this is something that we have seen in several places. It's true that maybe in the first years of the convention, underwater cultural heritage was presented as being truly an heritage linked to the European expansionism, to different to shipwrecks as the main site, and disregarding or not knowing the heritage that is understood by the different communities in different parts of the world. So the inclusion of different narratives is essential, and is something that we see that is happening already through the international bodies of the convention. So it makes different recommendations towards these aims. And it's something that we see also in the different capacity, in the different initiatives, assistance offered by UNESCO, the different capacity building initiatives. They started being programs that were teaching specifically the introduction to the core elements of understanding underwater sites, underwater archaeological sites, how to record them, how to physically protect them, the in situ preservation. And now those capacity building programs, to which many ICOMOS members are contributing, is moving towards adding also the issues of management, towards marine heritage also, climate change, sustainable development, and policy making as elements that are needed also in the governance of heritage by different experts. So we see how this moves forward. Also, in 2015, the meeting of the parties approved the designation of a kind of list of best practices for underwater cultural heritage protection. This list was focused quite a lot in public access to underwater cultural heritage. And even if it's being reviewed now with a huge work of this scientific and technical advisory body, there is new science that will be introducing more and more encouragements like that one sentence to include appropriate stakeholders, as we have seen in many of the practices that have been already inscribed, like for instance, Mexico inscribed the work with communities in the protection of heritage in the Nevado of Toluca, in the Yucatan Peninsula. So the work that some countries are doing to insert that local realities into national policies and present it into the international sphere is huge, but there is still a huge way to go if we want to have that among at least all the members of the state parties. And other actions of UNESCO, especially related to the assistance done by the scientific and technical advisory body, have shown also that need to understand and follow up the impact or the indirect impact that UNESCO may have in the local realities and narratives. Whereas the scientific and technical advisory body missions have been completely a success in helping the countries to follow the rules of the annex of the convention and to identify the main issues, especially when treasure hunters or different interested parties are presenting projects that don't look like professional, or they don't have, or they don't follow the rules. There are other issues, like for instance, we saw in the workshop that we did with local communities in the island of San Marie, together with the African Center for Heritage Activities. We saw that due to the big press and visibility given to UNESCO actions, also to the actions of a previous treasure hunter in the island, and the actions of the decided by the government, the national government in Madagascar, for instance, the local community were somehow feeling isolated and not in appropriation of their own heritage. They were feeling, and they were putting in the same box, UNESCO, treasure hunters, and the national government, that were coming here without involving the community and taking the heritage or the news after, that they were thinking, that the heritage was taken because there was an explanation. And whereas UNESCO did a big effort in order to communicate these things, is obviously through campaigns and education at a local level, where and national stakeholders with international cooperation can help on this. Somehow this made that in San Maria Island, the traditional ways of working and protecting heritage, there was a traditional way of not fishing or not making activities in places where they were faddy, not kind of places, taboo places with sacred spirits from the ancestors, places where accidents in the sea happened. So there's some way, these dynamics made that some people in the community attempted to break this traditional knowledge that they had. But we see that this is completely changing with the new UNESCO missions that we are seeing and the involvement of major communities. And one is the example of the UNESCO mission to Guatemala, in which the first phase took place in 2019, I believe. All the reports and everything is available on the UNESCO website, and you can see how the first mission was specifically to involve the local communities around Lake Atitlan in order to agree on the actions to be taken all together. Now, I mean, I think I only have 5 minutes, and I want you also to mention how solutions are coming also from the field, from the field of research. We never have to disregard. We need to link, and it's something that maybe at international level and bureaucratic level and decision-making level has been difficult to join the results from the scientific research towards the making of policies, and recommendations at that time. It's specifically what we are doing in Challenge, in Rising from the Depths. I recently joined the University of Edinburgh, but specifically within a project called Rising from the Depths, which is a project that using challenge-led research in marine cultural heritage tries to see how this heritage it can be productive for local communities in different areas of Eastern Africa, like Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, or Madagascar. There are 27 projects being financed by this network that at the same time is financed by UK Global Challenges Research Fund. And among all these projects that are entering now the later phase, the last phase in which they are constructing their own outcomes, and we are seeing already those results, we see how many different results can form policies that could help integrating the community's views, narratives, and uses of heritage in the national policies that are responding to the international way of seeing heritage. Most of the countries here, even if they haven't ratified the 2001 convention, they are applying the annex, so they are trying to continue the work done in maritime archaeology, especially Kenya, we see is one of the countries more advanced. Madagascar has ratified the 2001 convention and is doing things related to that. One of the projects in Madagascar is right in St. Maria Island that I talked before, and is by some of the students of capacity buildings of UNESCO that is continuing working with communities for that. So some of the results from these projects, very basically, that we are looking at, as I said, we are analyzing the outcomes and on an ongoing process in order to present policies and recommendations to states. We see that many of the projects are empowering communities and vulnerable groups in heritage research and protection for social and ecological and economic benefits. Some of the projects like Match to Discover Mida Creek in Kenya by Cesar Vita, also an ICOMOS colleague from us, is working also with different vulnerable groups and of women and youth specifically to understand, map, and the marine cultural heritage in the area and use it for their own benefit in the for sustainable uses, and improve economic viability of these areas. Other, for instance, like Protecting the Past, Preserving the Future by Dario Daviti, has identified how in a big project like the Lamu port, Lamu is a World Heritage Site in the northern Kenya, that they are building a huge port and being linked to a path corridor that links several countries in Eastern Africa to have access to the Indian Ocean and to the wider network of trade, maritime trade. They identify how, even if there were some measures considered for the local communities, marine cultural heritage, more in the terms of intangible heritage values, has been widely affected because there wasn't an existence, a protocol for involvement, participation, and consultation, something that is being now drafted and proposed. All the projects are resulting in the integration of community protocols and traditional regulations into national policies. Some of them, for instance, also in Kenya, are looking for the creation of a protocol in the Kilifi County, for instance, for the community, the local communities to have in order to negotiate with external actors, like, for instance, offshore industries, big fisheries, and to integrate in those protocols the national policies together with the traditional knowledge and practices. That also is seen in Tanzania and also seen in Madagascar, where the DINA, which is the traditional regulations they have, is creating some heritage protection zones through the beliefs and ways of traditional activities of the community, linking that to the different national legislation. So there are different paths in which we can see the inclusion of local knowledges and local voices into the big governance of underwater cultural heritage, or if not marine cultural heritage as a whole. Others are using this traditional knowledge and arts and performing arts and way to communicate, give outreach and give information in order to build up different strategies for climate change mitigation, for resilience, and more sustainable uses of the environment. I think my time is up, so I'm going to finish with these recommendations of how, we are working towards the integration of the local within the global debates, but there is debates, but we have to definitely work much more, all of us, and include obviously the local voices of that. There is already, through the theory of change and the creation of results framework for the 2001 Convention, the idea to consider by the state parties of creating a reporting mechanism in which all these things can be tackled, how states in the implementation of international instruments, the 2001 Convention, are involving stakeholders somehow. So this is something that will be developed in the next 2 years or so. Together with that, it's also foreseen the establishment of an international platform to boost dialogue and representation of communities, local communities, and especially indigenous communities that in most cases may have different ways of approaching natural and cultural heritage, or even understanding what is heritage and how to quantify it or how to protect it. Then the intersection of notions of cultural landscapes and ecosystem-based approaches in UCH management, not only in the convention that could be debated, that in the operational guidelines could be somehow inserted for debate also, to be, to widen somehow the view we have of management, but also in management. And then developing community-based capacity building strategies at international level. We have that through the international cooperation in projects like Rising from the Depths, but also comes to mind the activities of the Honor Force Foundation in the Eastern Mediterranean that are working also in some of these aspects. And then challenge-led research in marine cultural heritage can inform policies to better achieve the international agreed sustainable goals. Well, that's all my reflection that I had to share with you. I hope, I gave you some ideas or to see the things in a wider sense, and to see also behind the scenes how there are some challenges that are still there, and that we have as community, as heritage practitioners, as people interested in marine cultural heritage, climate change, over nature, over ocean, we have to address in order through addressing the global challenges, protecting at local level, and reiterating the sentence that we have to think globally, act locally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arturo. Thanks also that you could finish on time. Usually you prefer to speak longer.
No, thank you. No, I thought as Tatiana is not here, so I better take more time. That's all.
Okay, thank you. Okay, dear colleagues, if you would like to ask some questions to Arturo, this is on time.
I think Athena has raised her hand.
Yes, Athena, we are listening to you.
It's actually not Athena. I'm afraid of hindsight.
Very nice voice, Athena.
And you have two cameras. Where am I looking? I'm looking over there. Sorry. I'm really curious about the work you're doing with Edinburgh down in Africa, and with all of the long-term widespread projects that you have going on. I'm curious if there's going to be any sort of follow-up on the results of those projects. So say 5 years after the project is finished, or 7 years after, is there going to be an effort to go back and to see if there's any sort of continuation of the efforts and the results that you've created?
That's a very good question. And it's one of the things I said also as one of the challenges that we have at the international level is to have that evaluation and follow-up of policies. Eventually, yes, that's one of the things that we intended. Right now, we are looking into the outcomes that are coming. Obviously, we know the outcomes that were intended, because of the applications. Obviously, most of the projects suffer from the COVID lockdown because many of the projects were half UK, half local partners, and many of the others were local partners only. So they were the people that are doing exactly what they thought it was best for their own heritage in that sense. So they are coming and they are looking. We are looking into that. The idea, and is as we are working, is to strengthen the network that has been created.
Yeah.
There is a network between all the different experts that are joining Rising from the Depths that is also linked to the network already created by UNESCO, because many are the same, and also ICOMOS members in the region that we have to strengthen in order to follow up these actions. Also, we are also looking into getting also funding to do all the monitoring and follow up. But definitely, I mean, if we weren't looking into follow up of the projects in the long term from the same PIs, the same program investigators that are dealing them and seeing how this is really changing things, we couldn't be there. No? I mean, we will be doing exactly the same as many other projects have done before, in which we have recommendations, we have very good results for 20 years ago, but as we haven't followed that up, we need to do exactly the same. So yeah, definitely. The idea is also to liaise with UNESCO in country, but also national commissions in order to do continued monitoring on how they are using the capacities, even if not at national level, also through institutions, through universities, or through municipalities and the NGOs. Some of the projects have created different NGOs at local level, done by women's group, youth, fishing people. So these organizations are the ones that we want to see continuing, because it's platforms for a change and platforms that will be also addressing the issues that they may be having in the heritage governance.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, one question.
Arturo, really wonderful. Yes. A lot to think about in that presentation, and a lot of similarities between things I think we're encountering from the NOAA side in the Pacific. I'm curious about the definition of UCH in your opinion. In the presentation, you kind of position it on a somewhat of a continuum between, you know, the earlier properties definition of UCH and the later, you know, Henderson 2019 explicit recognition of intangible cultural heritage. But the definition itself, as we have it, you know, do you feel on that continuum it's more towards the properties, or there's flexibility in all traces of cultural resources, perhaps even being, you know, the location of a specific cultural activity without an actual property? Where does our current UCH definition fall between those two?
Yeah, no, thank you. Maybe, I mean, I didn't put it clear. Definitely, I mean, I think obviously that the water cultural heritage definition we have in the convention today, it came directly from the archaeological physical remains to be protected. But I think the definition is wide enough in order to interpret also all the type of links. In a previous version of the definition, there was a previous version of the definition that included the values of local and indigenous communities too. That was rejected from the final versions because different issues also of, you know, how can we subjectively, you know, measure those values itself. The convention itself talks about the importance of protecting the archaeological and natural context of the site themselves. So it's somehow, I mean, it may be a bit tricky, but looking at it, I mean, it really gives the space to talk about marine cultural heritage, natural heritage in the wider sense, looking always from the point of view of the physicality of the heritage. It happens with the 72 convention. I mean, they never changed the definition they had for cultural heritage, and it came from the 72. They were looking at cultural property. They talk about monuments. So it's the 72 convention is the quintessential definition of what we understood as a Western cultural heritage property in the 60s and 70s, and even farther beyond from Western countries. But they changed it, and the definitions, especially pushing from Asian countries and also Pacific states, they changed the operational guidelines. Now they're saying, well, this definition could also entail these things, or entailing the management of cultural landscape, etc. I'm not saying it's easy to move away from that definition. We shouldn't, because I mean, we are talking about underwater archaeology. We shouldn't move away from the conservation practices. We are talking about preservation mainly. It's quite technical convention, but we should give some space also to incorporate different narratives and different values that may be of importance in the understanding of marine heritage for indigenous communities, for instance, in Africa or India, in the Indian Ocean, etc., Pacific Ocean. And I think the convention may have some space for that to be interpreted in the operational guidelines, but mainly when giving recommendations for the management of those sites. And I think maybe in the rules of the annex of the convention, that could be much more explained in a wider sense. You know, when we practice different activities directed to underwater cultural heritage, we have to take this into consideration. Maybe there is a way in which, in the explanation of the rules of the annex, we can widen the concept. It's already widened the concept in the different training programs, in the manual that we have for the foundational courses. I mean, the importance of communities is already there. It's a matter of how to bring that into a policy level so countries can follow, you know, and bring for that. Maybe it's not in the 2001 convention. Maybe we have to look into other instruments. The 72 convention, the World Heritage Convention, covers also underwater cultural heritage that is in the territorial waters, even if it doesn't say so. But it gives the obligation to states in Article 5 to protect all heritage that is found under their jurisdiction, apart from the list. So I don't know, there are ways on that, and also the cultural charter rights for indigenous communities, etc. So it's a matter of joining that and maybe creating policies and recommendations in that sense. So I'm sorry if I'm just building up on reflections from what you have asked me. Sorry.
Thank you. Hans, would you like to add something? Okay, now this is the turn of Chris.
Thanks, Hakan, and a big thanks to Arturo for giving us a very clear vision of where we were and where we're heading, I suppose. And I just want to pick up the point a little bit covered by Matthew and Hans, is that we're in no question, and I think you mentioned it right at the beginning, we're at a moment where we're changing, not necessarily direction, but certainly amplifying the range of things that we should be considering as cultural heritage, underwater cultural heritage, etc. I wonder to what extent the knowledge that you now have and reflected in the Rising from the Depths is, apart from this capacity strengthening and development courses that we're all involved, or many of us are involved in, how it's percolating down to the practitioner and how they're revisiting their own project designs to take into account many of the things that you've made very clear during your presentation.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, actually, and maybe difficult, because I mean, I think when inserting maybe local knowledge narratives and a wider view, I mean, we have to look into specific cases. I mean, we couldn't talk about you know, one case fits all, I think, in that sense. So if I understood correctly, I mean, that's when the practitioner comes, you know, I know that coming from all the conservation techniques and archaeological knowledge I may have in that sense. I mean, it's about the involvement of those local realities. And in some places, and I know it may sound difficult and it's something that we'll have to confront, it's that dialogue that will build up and will create, you know, bigger values to the heritage itself and the way we practice archaeology. I mean, I'm not saying we have to move away from the traditional practices that we do. I'm saying that sometimes in some phases, maybe, I mean, especially in policy making, we have to include also some other narratives and voices, even if those voices are dissonant. And in some places they will be dissonant. No, it's a matter of seeing how, and that will be a conflict, is where we need those policies and protocols in order to see how we avoid conflicts. I mean, obviously there will be different views of heritage and what needs to be protected. Communities that they don't really want to protect heritage or give different priorities. We need to talk and address those issues with the view of protecting heritage, as the policy is saying, as we believe, you know, is our goal as heritage practitioners, but also involving in a dialogue that they can understand better why this is done, why there is a benefit from underwater cultural heritage in the places to themselves too. In some places that will mean maybe bringing them towards the dialogue of sustainable development, bringing out from isolation some communities. I mean, it's a difficult subject that definitely we need to address, but definitely what I was saying mainly is also that they need to somehow have a voice if they want in all these issues, because there are policies that affect them. At the level of practitioners is more involvement and working with communities. There are now different debates also on indigenous maritime archaeology. And it's quite interesting. It comes from Australia, it comes from Canada, from the States too. And it's also archaeology done with a point of view from the local communities and indigenous communities without losing everything that is being taught in maritime archaeology conservation identification practices. No? So yeah, it's a debate that we have to have and maybe look into specific cases. I don't know if I responded to your question, but I was mainly reflecting widely.
And more, I think, but
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you, Arturo. Thank you, Chris. Now, Marc-Andre.
Yes. Hi, Arturo, and thank you for a great presentation. Just a quick question. I think the Skirky Banks example is a great one for wrecks in international waters. But what do you think is that model sustainable? Is it how transferable is it to other sites in deep, in open ocean for the wrecks that basically are homeless in a way? Is that it's a good precedent, but how viable is that?
That's a good question. I mean, I shouldn't say. I mean, I think as a first example, and I need as exemplar examples, I think countries need to see that this international cooperation can achieve something. I'm wondering how, I mean, scientific relevant it is. It will be definitely. I mean, there is an international mission being carried there by the international community, led by France. With different international experts that in some cases haven't worked together before. Definitely gives an example, and I think, I mean, the interests of the people who are in those committees have a mix of technical advice, international, and believing really on the work that we need to do at international waters, but at the same time there is an interest from the countries to be seen, as international practitioners of heritage. And the example is in these committees of the Skirky Banks, you have on one side technicians and on the other side representatives of the government. So there is a mix of foreign interests together with national interests. How sustainable this is, I mean, it may be relevant in the exclusive economic zones that happen in the Mediterranean, in which you have a coordinating state and maybe conflictive interest from other places. So you create a coordinating agreement between all of them to, because those agreements can be in a wider term, always that, comply with the convention. But it's true how this sustainable could be in international waters in the area, and how can we follow up and survey, and what is the power between countries to survey and follow up what is being done. And that probably creates new mechanisms and much more bureaucracy is what I believe, in order to, create permits that have to be approved between all countries. I don't know, that's my view, whereas before maybe that wasn't really needed. But I think, I mean, the example of having international consultation and reporting of the activities that are being done, and that countries that are around in that coordination mechanism can have the option to join those activities or to go and evaluate what is being done, because there is, a network that allows for doing that. But obviously, I mean, it's the national state who has to give that permit to supervise those. I mean, it's needed. But I think on the long run, it may prove that we will need new tools to facilitate that, because it's going to create a wide, discussion and agreements and bureaucracy. And if there are countries that they are interested in participating, but they have dissonant views on what to do, on how to act over some heritage, definitely, I mean, that will have to be seen, But I mean, I'm really waiting for that, because I mean, it's the way we see it will work. I mean, we see now with the convention, the Skirky Banks, how these mechanisms that during years we were saying, well, I mean, will it work? Definitely. Well, we will see that at least it's putting an example and it's agreeing on people, and at least on paper and on the visibility that it gives internationally is important. And the case of the Skirky Banks deals with many ancient sites and World Heritage sites. So it's quite traditional, and the convention feels very comfortable within it. If that is going to be a different type of site with different values, we will see, and it will be very interesting to see when that happens.
Thank you, Arthur. It's very nice explanation. We have no time, but we have one more question as the last question from Akufumi. Yes, Akufumi.
Yes. Okay. Well, I have small two practical questions. And Arturo, you presented the framework around international cooperation and water cultural heritage management, including UNESCO, of course, ICOMOS, and state parties and local community. It's fine. But on the other hand, you know, 20 years has passed since we had the 2000 convention, but in East Asia and Southeast Asia, only one country has ratified. Only Cambodia has ratified. As far as I think, situation is not getting better. I would like to know your view about this Asian situation, in particular East Asia and Southeast Asia. And the second question, your idea, marine cultural heritage, it's fine, and you know it. I'm also working community-based management of such underwater cultural heritage, such as stone tidal wares. But practically, it's not easy for me to look for money, research fund, because these underwater cultural heritage is not shipwreck. If I say shipwreck, could get money from TV companies and newspapers, and of course, central government, national government. But if I'm doing underwater cultural heritage around intertidal zones, it's not so easy to, and not many people are interested in. And I would like to know your opinion about such kind of situation.
Arturo, I really don't know how you will be able to answer these long questions in 2 minutes. Okay.
I mean, give me 5 minutes. I mean, we have to leave. Yeah, no, but I mean, the first, I mean, about Asia problem. The Asia problem has to do with, I said about the. I believe it has to do a lot with the discourse of UNESCO and how the water archaeology internationally has focused so much on treasure hunting, on shipwrecks, etc., without looking into all the concepts of authenticity and the ways and heritage is being understood. And I think, I mean, terms like marine cultural heritage or others can be applied also in this sense. Also, I mean, the relation and the way UNESCO has been dealing with the subject, maybe in our ASEAN countries, hasn't been probably the most adequate in the sense. Always coming with a different view instead of reading. I mean, there are many colleagues there that they have their own ideas on how this can improve, and definitely the 2001 Convention has a lot to do. Now, even we have next week a national consultation in Mongolia dealing with landlocked countries that are interested. So the interest is there. It's a matter of explaining better and understanding what they want. So that's one question. The other question, very briefly, marine cultural heritage. Yeah, I understand that the structures, the management structures that we have in countries are separating the links between different heritage. We see how we have natural heritage in one organization, and then we have land archaeology in other, tangible, and maybe underwater is understood another. Then shipwrecks, if governments are prioritizing shipwrecks, especially because of recent history, maybe like Japan with the World War II, or other types of history, like in Spain with shipwrecks related to the expansionism period. That prioritization has to do also with national narratives and the way they are looking into underwater cultural heritage. It's a matter also of trying to present the beneficial links that has the marine cultural heritage and work towards that. For instance, I mean, the project Rising from the Dead received funding because of that, because presenting underwater cultural heritage as a part of a wider vision and links in that maritime cultural landscape view. And talking also about challenges and about global issues, how this is going to help achieving the goals that the different governments are contributing to. So it's the different mechanisms and seeing where these are. But I completely agree that the way we are speaking international and the way conventions are being presented have created that national legislations are being separated or not being regarded together. Or in synergies. And this is something that countries and archaeologists and practitioners are asking international organizations to do. I'm not talking only about UNESCO, I'm talking also about ICOMOS, ICROM, etc. It's something that we archaeologists know, but I mean, the policy making that don't have separate structures. And this is something that we have to aim also to start changing.
Thank you very much, Arturo. Now we are here at the end of the 10th webinar of ICOMOS ICOUCH, and I would like to give the floor for a very short closing speech to Chris.
Well, thank you, Hakan, and a big thank you to Arturo. I think you've stirred the pot a little bit today, got some very interesting questions which are broad-reaching, broad-scoping, and given, I think, most of us a lot of things to think about. And obviously, around the table of UCH, we are in the process of discussing many of these things. So once again, many thanks, Arturo. Many thanks, Hakan, for organising this. And we look forward to seeing everybody at webinar 11 in a month's time. Thanks very much and look forward to seeing you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Hakan. Thank you to all.